meeting. The seminar I'm going to teach tomorrow night from 6 to 8 will build on a lot of the things I'm talking about tonight. So it'll kind of be part 2, a sequel, I guess you'd say. And that does say domestic abuse, and it looks great on my computer, but hopefully the rest of the slides will look all right. Let's begin with a very brief survey of the situation. 1 in 4 women, yeah, looks great. 1 in 4 women have experienced domestic abuse at some point in their lives. 1 in 4. And the statistics are the same for women inside the church as they are outside the church. Christian women and non-Christian are the same. Now I know what some of you, at least some of you, are thinking. Not in Village 7. That just can't be. We have to be the exception. I used to think similar thoughts when I heard statistics like this. And then in a period of a few months, we found out there were 4 women in our church who were in abusive relationships. We have a church of 275. So it was overwhelming. And that's when I started the refuge. We found out about the first one. Some awareness grew in the congregation, and then the rest just kind of fell like dominoes. So yes, your church, Village 7, 1 in 4. 1 in 4. Now that includes women who experienced abuse as children. All right, that's an important qualification. Not all of them are currently in abusive marriages. So although 1 in 4 women are survivors of abuse, that does not mean that 1 out of 4 men in your church are perpetrators of abuse. That's a really, really important qualification to make. At the same time, if it's 1 in 4, there are probably more abusive marriages right now in your church than you're aware of. Since the 4 we found out about, we've discovered at least 2 more in the 2 years following. So between 90 and 95% of the survivors of domestic abuse are women. So throughout this seminar, tonight and tomorrow, I'll be referring to the survivors as women. I'll use the pronoun her. And I'll refer to perpetrators as men. Men can be abused by their wives. We actually have a case right now in our church, one that we know of, where the woman is abusive. But as you can see by the statistic, it's very rare. And the dynamics are just different in a way that actually makes it less traumatic for men than it would be for women. The threat of intimidation is usually just not there. Yes, a question?
When you talk about domestic abuse, are you just talking about physical?
Nope, I'll get into that in just 1 second. You're actually anticipating where I'm going next. Yeah. So the dynamics of a relationship are different when the woman is abusive, and it does make it less traumatic for the men. So what do I mean by domestic abuse? It's an excellent question. Domestic abuse is a form of oppression in which a person uses certain behavior patterns to control their intimate partner. We'll be returning to this definition later tonight and then in the seminar tomorrow, but I just wanted to put it up there for you so you know what I'm talking about. It's a form of oppression in which a person uses certain behavior patterns to control their intimate partner. Now you'll see certain behavior patterns. By the way, there's a really nice background on here that you guys can't see. You're missing out. So it's not just black and white. But anyway. What are these certain behavior patterns that I'm talking about? What behaviors comprise domestic abuse? Let's talk about that a little bit. There are 5 different types of domestic abuse. 5. The most common type is psychological abuse. Psychological abuse is any non-physical behavior designed to control someone through degradation, humiliation, or fear. Psychological abuse is comprised of several different behavior patterns. I don't have the time to go through all of them, so I'm just going to hit on the ones that we encounter the most. First, there is verbal abuse, so insulting or demeaning someone. Many Christian men are great at doing this without swearing. You fat cow. One I heard recently was, you are cancer in my bones. Haven't said a single swear word, but boy is she humiliated and belittled. Also, constantly criticizing someone or blaming her for everything that goes wrong. A phrase I hear all the time is, I feel like I'm constantly walking on eggshells. If anything goes wrong, it's my fault. And he'll berate me for it, criticize me for it, nitpick everything. Another pattern is intimidation. Intimidation is controlling a person through the threat of physical harm. So invading personal space, raising your voice, towering over someone, yelling at her, throwing things, punching holes in the wall, damaging personal property. We've got a guy who used to rip doors off of hinges. And he's actually not a very big guy. Just a raw display of physical power. When a man does that, when he punches a hole in the wall, or when he takes a lamp and throws it in rage, what he's saying to his wife is, this could be you. That's the message she hears. This could be you. You better watch your step because this is what I'm capable of. Also raising a hand, not actually hitting her, but raising a hand, threatening to hit her. Blocking an exit. So he's verbally abusing her, berating her. She wants to leave, and he just steps right in front of her. And with his physical presence, blocks her from leaving. Threats are a very common form of abuse. Threatening to physically harm her, threatening to leave her, which can be very distressing if she is economically dependent upon him. Also, she doesn't want to break up the family. Threatening to commit suicide. We have one woman, she cycled out of the refuge now, but her husband held a gun to his head and threatened to kill himself if she didn't do what he wanted. And she had nightmares afterwards for months. It was very traumatizing for her. And this man, I met him. He was the sweetest Southern gentleman you've ever met, talking to me. But you start pushing him on the way he treats his wife, and a completely different side comes out. It was really quite incredible. Isolation. Attempting to control who your partner sees, what she does, or her goals in life. So monitoring her phone calls, her texts, her emails, which is very easy to do with iCloud and similar things now. I can get all my wife's text messages if I want. Threatening to, I already said that. Monitoring her time and activities away from the house. So when she gets home, she has to account for where she's been, how long she was there. He adds the time up, sees if it makes sense. Prohibiting work or involvement in church or other activities. Now, if a husband and wife sit down and talk reasonably, and she wants to work and he doesn't want her to, and they work through it and she ends up not working, that's one thing. It's another for a husband to say, you may not work, end of discussion, and to not even talk about it. Prohibiting activities with church, small group is another one. We had a guy who would provoke arguments with his wife on the way to church and then quote the verse in Matthew 5 that says, bring your gift to the altar and your brother has a conflict with you, lay your gift, first go be reconciled. And he'd say, well, we can't go to church because we're in a conflict. And then he started doing that to keep her from going to small group, because small group was an extension of the church. Discouraging or prohibiting relationships with family and friends. A very common rule in abusive households is when you're home, no talking on the phone. And they put it as, I want you focused on our family. Really, he wants her undivided attention. Another example would be it could be something simple like always talking bad about her friends when she's around, which is a very subtle way of discouraging her from being around them. One that's particularly insidious is called crazy making, causing a person to doubt her perception of reality. Most simple is telling a person they're crazy. You are nuts. You should be committed. We should take you down to the psych ward. We have a inpatient mental health clinic in Kalispell called Pathways, and I'd never heard of it until I started the refuge. And I started hearing all these women say, sometimes I wonder if I should just check myself into Pathways. I started hearing that over and over again. Insinuating that she's misinterpreting reality, misinterpreting events, insinuating that she's exaggerating or lying. With this kind of thing, it's the cumulative effect over years. When someone tells you or insinuates that you're crazy over a decade, eventually you start to believe it. particularly when it's always, you did this to me, you're treating me in this way. And his response is, you're crazy. You're nuts. That's not what I did. It has a huge psychological toll on her. Using children as pawns, using the children to manipulate or control your partner. He may threaten to hurt the children. He may manipulate the children into taking his side against the mother, threatening to take the children away, either through legal means or through kidnapping, actually kidnapping the children. We've had that happen once. Are there any questions about psychological abuse before I go on? The other 4 types are much quicker, or much more brief. Psychological abuse has got a lot under it. Are there any questions at all about any of the things I've mentioned so far? Okay. Yes?
Does this tend to stay hidden within the confines of the...
Very much so. Very much so. Abusive men, pretty much by definition, are completely different behind closed doors. Most of them are very, very likable. I talked about the sweet southern gentleman I met. Very likable. So that's part of the isolation as well. He doesn't want her having relationships where she can tell people what he's doing. So it does. Yes?
One of the reasons I asked you whether it was just physical or other, it seems like 1 in 4 is awfully low considering the divorce rate is above 60%.
Mm-hmm.
So I would argue almost that with divorce, there's got to be some sort of domestic abuse component involved in it somewhere. So is 1 in 4 awfully light?
Yeah, I chose the most conservative estimate. There's a few different estimates, and I chose the most conservative to present. But yeah, it could be. It's hard when you talk about psychological abuse. The only things we have objective numbers on are men who are convicted of assaulting their partner. And that's a fairly low percentage when you consider psychological abuse is not illegal. There's no convictions for that. So yeah. Yes?
This situation of psychological abuse, so it's her word against her husband. So how do you know what's true and what's not then in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great point. Because typically the women come in, it's knowing these patterns of behavior. Most women that we meet with don't come in and say, I'm being abused. A few do, but most don't. They don't know. They tell us what's happening. And we have the framework to understand this is abusive. Also, for a woman to say she's being abused when she's not, to say the husband's not abusive, you're automatically making a lot of assumptions about her. That she's exaggerating or lying, that she's deceptive, that she has somehow gone to all of the trouble to research what abusive patterns of behavior look like so she can lie about it. I mean, think about that's assuming a lot of sin in someone. So it's knowing the patterns of behavior. Abuse looks like this. Does that answer your question? Okay. It's similar if you go to a doctor and you say, here's my symptoms. And he says, well, here's what you've got. Spiritual abuse, an attempt to use a person's faith to manipulate and control them. So questioning her salvation to the children. You know your mom's not saved, right? Using scripture to belittle or threaten her. It will not go well with you. We hear that all the time. It will not go well with you. Or to justify unreasonable expectations. One guy that I work with, he'll quote the proverb to his wife, rejoice in the wife of your youth, let her breast satisfy you always. And he'll camp out on the word always. That means you have to give me sex whenever I want. So they'll twist scripture to justify unreasonable expectations, to control her through guilt. Also demanding submission. Now, we're conservative, Reformed evangelical Christians. We know that Scripture calls wives to submit to their husbands. The problem is that abusive men take things that are good and true and twist them into perverted shadows of what they were originally intended to be. I've been married 12 years. That's not probably half as long as many of you. But I've been married 12 years, and I've never had to tell my wife to submit. Some husbands may need to tell their wives to submit a few times over the duration of a marriage. Maybe. In the average Christian abusive home, the word submission is used multiple times a week, if not every day. It's constant. He uses it to justify getting whatever he wants whenever he wants it. You have to submit. Economic abuse is behavior that controls and dominates a person financially. So he'll control all the finances. Again, nothing wrong with a husband managing the books. But economic abuse looks like making her account for every penny she spends, refusing to inform her regarding the finances. Often she won't even have access to the bank account or a debit card. She'll have to ask him for money, and he'll dole it out when he pleases. Threatening to withdraw financial support. We had a woman who her husband was a trucker, and that's how he'd control her when he was on the road. If she didn't do what he wanted, he would not send her money. And she had no job. She had 6 children. No access to any of the funds except what he would send her. So she was at his absolute mercy. And when you have a woman who's taken 10, 15 years of her life to raise 6 children, telling her to just go get a job, that's really hard. You know, I mean, there's a lot more going on there. That's just like a Band-Aid. She's got a lot of responsibilities. This particular woman had no education beyond a high school diploma, very little work history, because she spent so much time with her kids. So she was at his absolute mercy. Sexual abuse. Any unwanted contact or interaction that occurs for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator. Basically, domestic abuse does not stop once the couple enters the bedroom. Examples would be pressuring or manipulating her into having sex, forcing her to watch pornography, making her perform sexual acts she is uncomfortable with. That's a very common one. Making sexual advances in public or in front of the children. And I don't mean, let's go home and have a little fun after whatever we're doing. I mean, grabbing a wife's breast in front of the children, things that are just absolutely treating her like an object as opposed to a person and humiliating to her. In some cases, forced sex or marital rape. The marital rape can be quite violent. You get a man who's physically abusive. That doesn't stop when they enter the bedroom. We've had women be strangled during sex with their husbands. We've had all kinds of stuff. And then the worst cases, I haven't run across one of these, but I've read about it. Forced homosexuality or sex with another man. Again, I haven't had any of those cases, but I've read about that happening. Physical abuse would be the 5th type. Any behavior that dominates a person through physical force or violence. This is everything from grabbing and pushing to hitting, kicking, pulling hair, strangling, assault with a weapon, gun, knife. We had a guy who was a bow hunter, fire an arrow at his wife. And then the worst cases would be attempted or committed homicide. We've had 2 cases of attempted homicide that we've dealt with. None successful. It's a good thing. Now, a very important thing to know about domestic abuse is that it always begins with psychological abuse and builds to physical. Every time. Now, not every relationship gets that far. Not every abusive relationship is physical. I would say about half the women in the refuge, it's not physical abuse. So it's not like once abuse starts, it will inevitably become physical. That's not the case. But if he's abusing her physically, he is also abusing her psychologically and in some of these other areas. Every time. Every time. It always starts with psychological and then builds from there. That's a really, really important thing to grasp. So how do all of these behaviors affect a marriage? Well, there's a lot of things I could list, but just to give you the biggest, most important one, it creates a power imbalance. The husband dominates his wife through fear. She lives in fear of him, and as a result, he gets what he wants. There's an enormous power imbalance. This is why we define domestic abuse as a form of oppression. To oppress is to crush or burden someone by the abuse of power or authority. That's for Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. There's an inherent power imbalance in oppression, right? You think of the slave trade. One person or group is dominating and controlling the other. There's also an inherent power imbalance in abusive relationships. And understanding this power imbalance is absolutely critical to responding to abuse appropriately. This power imbalance impacts every area of the marriage, and it makes it very different from all other marriages. Even a marriage that's heavily conflicted, where the couple is just at each other's throats all the time, may look on the outside abusive, but if there's not a power imbalance, really the dynamics of the interpersonal relationship are completely different. So this power imbalance, it impacts every facet of the way that you minister to an abusive couple. A minute for questions. Any questions about... I told you. A lot of questions always. Yes?
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So, are these men generally sociopaths? And
No.
They're not?
No, they're not.
They're not. Second question. So, I'm a little heavy in terms of, I'm married 25 years, but I have
Sure.
a daughter that is a close relationship, might be
Yeah.
married for a couple of years, and so
Yeah.
I'm projecting forward. So,
Yeah.
how does a father, how does a prospective daughter look at a young man who's acting like wonderful,
Yeah.
and then marriage happens, and then it
Yeah.
becomes the
That's a
monster
great
you're talking
question.
about?
I can't answer it in full, but I can just very quickly give you a couple of things. First, look for red flags. Red flags would be if he tends to do things that are controlling, or if he tends to have a sense of entitlement, and we'll talk about control and entitlement tomorrow night. But entitlement, a sense that he is superior or has a different status than her. If she does all of the serving in the relationship, if that goes one way, that would be something to look for. Those are some red flags. If he gets in a fight or argument with her and he throws anything in anger, get her out of there. That's a huge red flag. The other side, and this is what makes it... I have 2 daughters. Not dating yet, thank God. I hope Jesus comes back before my daughters start dating after this ministry. What makes me concerned is the other side, if it's too good to be true. It probably is. The thing is, you can't always identify it beforehand. Sometimes he does just treat her like a queen, but he's abusive. Abuse tends to start when there's a major... when the commitment level in the relationship goes up. Or if there's already abuse, it will escalate. So when he proposes to her, when they get married, when she becomes pregnant with their first child or has their first child, if he might really become psychologically abusive once they're married, and then once she has their first child, he becomes physically abusive. So, another question?
Are there any characteristics, research, statistics showing why these men turn into abusive husbands?
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about that tomorrow night. I will say it's very common for abusive men to come from abusive households. Very common. But not all abusers came from abusive homes. And a lot of people come from abusive homes that don't turn out abusive. So there's not a direct correlation, but that's certainly a contributing factor. That'd be the first thing I'd point to. Basically, abuse is caused by a desire for power and control and a sense of superiority or entitlement. So whatever creates that idolatry in his heart, and we're going to talk about that at length tomorrow. But that's the cause, is the desires and motives of his heart. There are various contributing factors that can make that happen. Yeah. Last one. Yeah.
So I know that in my office, if I suspect abuse, I'm required to report that.
Okay. Can I ask what you do?
As a physician.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
as an elder, what is our response? We're working with a couple, this stuff starts all coming out. We suspect maybe some physical abuse.
Yeah.
What's our responsibility?
We'll talk more about this tomorrow in terms of how to help. But as a general rule, I would never report a case of domestic abuse to the police if it's a husband abusing the wife, for various reasons. The most notable being, the most common response is police do not end up arresting him. And then they leave, and he asks, who have you been talking to? What have you been doing? And then she is abused or beaten. Also because it creates a power imbalance, part of her recovery process is learning to take control of her own life from a human perspective and make her own decisions. A lot of them, survivors, don't want to make their own decisions. They don't know what it's like. And so if the police are going to be called, she needs to be the one who's willing to do that. Now, yeah, well, and I don't know what the state laws are in
I
Colorado.
was going to say, before you
Yeah.
say something, Don, can you address legal obligation of elders towards abuse? I know we've had Martin Nussbaum our attorney talk to us about that as staff. Do the elders have a legal obligation? Do you remember? His memory is a whole lot better than mine. That's what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
Well, now, recent ones.
Yeah, so for elders as well. So for physical abuse, that is a key component
Yeah,
there.
it is. It's a very different thing.
Our lawyer
Sure,
advises us to do
sure,
here.
sure. I would also say there is a difference. There's a difference between child abuse and spousal abuse. So if you have any indication of child abuse,
Yes.
I report it. I'm a mandatory reporter as a pastor. I report it right away. Any indication. That's just very different. Well, not very different, but just in terms of, I'm not willing to have a child's fate be determined by if their mother is ready to take that step. But for me personally, we don't call the police on spousal abuse. And I can give you horror story after horror
I
story.
recommend call the office. We will call our attorney.
There you go. That's a good way to
Seriously,
look
I
at
think
it.
that's why we
Yeah.
have it before. It's always good to get counsel from an expert before going further in lots of things in life, and
Yeah.
certainly this will be one.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go on. I only have an hour. So please come tomorrow. I think a lot of your questions probably will be addressed, and there'll be more time for questions and answers tomorrow as well. Now, because abusive marriages are so different from all other kinds of marriages, there are a lot of mistakes that I typically see. And so here are 5 common mistakes that you want to avoid. This would be on the back side of your handout, avoiding common mistakes. First, we've touched on this already. Domestic abuse is more than just physical violence. When we hear about psychological abuse or emotional and verbal abuse, some of us can be a little skeptical. I was. When I first heard the word emotional abuse from a woman's mouth, the first thing I thought was, give me a break. Please, really? Emotional abuse, is that even a thing? I mean, I didn't say that to her, but that's what I was thinking. And as it turned out, that was a marriage counseling case, and it was abusive. And that was my first one. That's when I started the refuge after that case. So we can be skeptical. But as you can see from the patterns I've explained to you, there's a lot more going on in an abusive relationship than just physical violence. A lot more. People who are experts in the field of domestic abuse, counselors, victims advocates, whatnot, they universally, none of them would limit domestic abuse to physical violence. None of them. The behavior patterns I've explained to you are universally acknowledged in the field. I'm not presenting you with one perspective among many. This is the way experts in domestic abuse assess the situation. And in fact, many women who've been physically abused have told me that the psychological abuse is actually more damaging. I've heard women say, if I could choose between physical and psychological abuse, I'd take the physical. Because the damage from physical abuse heals in a few days, few weeks. The damage from psychological abuse takes years, if not a lifetime, to overcome. So in a lot of ways, the only reason I would say physical abuse is worse than psychological is because if he's abusing her physically, he's also abusing her psychologically, so you have both. But taken by themselves, psychological abuse is incredibly, incredibly damaging. Second, domestic abuse is not an incident. It's a pattern of behavior. This should be clear from the behavior patterns that I've presented. Abuse is an entire approach to intimate relationships that flows from deeply entrenched idolatry. So if a man hits his wife, that is just the tip of the iceberg. He is also, there is a ton of stuff under the surface. So when you see something like Ray Rice clocking his wife in an elevator, and then he says, oh, I made a mistake, everyone makes mistakes, I'll never do it again, it's garbage. It's garbage. Because it's not one mistake or one incident. Men do not hit their wives once and that's it. That's not the way it happens. It's that he has a tie. His view of relationships is completely wrong and needs to be undone and replaced with something that's biblical. His entire approach and belief system toward relationships needs to be changed. So it's not an incident. It's a pattern of behavior. Third, if a woman tells you she's being abused, please do not tell her to submit. I'm serious. I've at this point in the seminar, it probably seems silly, but I've encountered it all the time. A woman came to me and told her pastor she was being physically abused, and he quoted the verse in Matthew that told her to turn the other cheek. He wasn't a PCA pastor, thank God, but he did. So if you tell her to submit, you will be colluding with the abuser. You will be reinforcing one of the primary tactics